Thorne gripped the steering wheel of his cruiser as the dispatch radio crackled with a frantic energy he had never heard in 15 years on the force, the voice of the operator breaking under the weight of reports that defied every law of nature and urban logic. He was cruising down Broadway when the first wave hit, a literal wall of dark fur and muscle exploding from the subway entrances like a pressure cooker blowing its lid. Hundreds of silverbacks and younger males surging into the daylight with roars that drowned out the sirens of the city. The sheer scale of the invasion was impossible to process. A sea of over 1,000 gorillas swarming the concrete canyons of New York, their powerful limbs propelling them over stalled yellow cabs and up the sides of brownstones with terrifying agility. Marcus slammed on his brakes as a massive male slammed onto the hood of his car, the metal crumpling like tinfoil under the beast's weight. And for a second, he stared into eyes filled with a primal intelligence and a focused, inexplicable rage. He drew his service weapon, the cold steel a small comfort against the chaos unfolding as the Great Ape Rebellion turned Times Square into a battlefield where the apex predators of the jungle met the apex predators of the asphalt. Glass shattered as gorillas swung from traffic lights, tearing down digital billboards that flickered with dying advertisements, while pedestrians fled in every direction, their screams joining the cacophony of barking orders from officers trying to form a line that was being decimated by sheer brute force. Marcus kicked his door open, rolling onto the pavement just as the gorilla on his hood lunged, its massive fist smashing through the windshield where his head had been a second before, and he fired a sequence of rounds that did a little more than graze the thick hide of the intruder. He realized quickly that conventional tactics were useless. This wasn't a riot or a heist, it was a total territorial takeover. And as he looked towards Central Park, he could see hundreds more silhouettes leaping from the trees, turning the green lung of the city into a staging ground for an assault on the very heart of civilization. He navigated through the wreckage of a bus, his lungs burning from the acrid smoke of burning rubber, and found himself regrouping with a handful of other officers behind a barricade of overturned trash cans and a fallen newsstand. They traded magazines and grim nods, the sound of rhythmic drumming on the sides of buildings echoing through the streets like a war march. And Marcus knew that if they didn't hold the line at 42nd Street, the island would be lost to the wild within the hour. He saw a sergeant being hoisted into the air by two primates, his screams cut short as he was tossed like a rag doll into a storefront window, and Marcus felt a cold resolve harden in his chest, a realization that the badge he wore was now a target in a war for the species. He found a discarded shotgun in a pool of oil and checked the chamber, the heavy thud of the action sliding home providing a momentary anchor in the madness. Every corner turned revealed a new horror. Gorillas dismantling police horses, apes using manhole covers as shields against the volley of rubber bullets, and a group of silverbacks systematically overturning every vehicle in their path to create a wall of wreckage that trapped the fleeing crowds. The air smelled of musk and ozone, the electrical grid sparking as gorillas chewed through hanging wires, plunging segments of the city into a premature, eerie darkness that favored the hunters over the hunted. Marcus led his small squad into the lobby of a skyscraper, hoping to gain the high ground, but the stairwells were already filled with the sound of heavy panting and the scraping of knuckles against marble. They fought floor by floor, a grueling vertical war where every landing was a choke point, and every office door could hide a 300-pound predator waiting to pounce. He fired until his barrel was hot, his ears ringing from the constant reports, and yet for every gorilla that fell, it seemed 3 more rose from the shadows of the concrete jungle to take its place. By the time they reached the roof, the sun was beginning to set, casting long, bloody shadows over a Manhattan that looked more like a prehistoric ruin than a modern metropolis. From his vantage point, Marcus could see the true scale of the disaster, the bridges blocked by massive piles of debris, and the rivers patrolled by apes who had learned to use hijacked ferries as floating fortresses. He looked at his remaining officers, their uniforms torn and faces smeared with soot, and he knew that while they might not survive the night, they would make the invaders earn every inch of the city. He checked his last magazine, signaled for the others to follow, and stepped back into the darkness of the stairwell, a lone officer in a city that had forgotten how to be civilized, ready to meet the wild head-on until the very end. The stairwell became a vertical gauntlet of shadows and heavy breathing as Marcus and his remaining squad descended back toward the street level, because they knew the high ground was nothing more than a gilded cage if they couldn't reclaim the tactical heart of the precinct. Each floor was a fresh nightmare of cubicles turned into nesting grounds, and server rooms where the humming cooling fans were now choked with thick fur and the scent of the wild. They moved in a tight diamond formation, with Marcus at the point, his eyes darting to every ventilation duct and open doorway, because he knew the guerrillas were using the building's internal infrastructure to bypass their defenses. Suddenly, the ceiling tiles above them exploded downward. A massive silverback dropped into their midst with the force of a falling anvil, crushing a rookie officer instantly under its sheer mass. Marcus didn't hesitate. He jammed the barrel of his shotgun into the thick muscle of the beast's shoulder and fired a slug that sent a spray of red across the acoustic tiles. But the gorilla barely flinched, instead swinging a tree trunk arm that sent Marcus flying through a drywall partition. He landed in a heap of plaster and office supplies, his vision swimming as he watched the rest of his team scramble to reload while the primate let out a deafening roar that vibrated in his very marrow. He scrambled to his feet, grabbing a heavy metal stapler and a jagged shard of glass from a broken partition, as he realized his shotgun had been kicked across the room beyond his reach. He lunged forward as the gorilla turned its attention to a female officer, pinned in the corner, using the glass shard to slice at the thick tendons of the ape's leg, causing it to stumble and roar in newfound agony. This moment of distraction allowed the surviving officers to concentrate their fire and finally bring the Titan down. But there was no time for mourning or catching their breath, because the sound of the struggle had alerted the rest of the pack in the building. They surged down the remaining flights of stairs, escaping onto the street, just as the lobby windows buckled outward under the pressure of dozens more charging apes. Outside, the city was a graveyard of chrome and glass, where the smoke from burning lithium batteries and electric cars created a toxic haze that stung their eyes and lungs. Marcus saw a group of guerrillas systematically tearing the doors off a precinct wagon to get to the riot gear inside, showing a terrifying level of adaptability as they began to don tactical vests and carry heavy polycarbonate shields like a mockery of the human force they were replacing. He led his group toward the remains of a subway entrance, thinking the tunnels might offer a way to move unseen. But the darkness below was alive with the rhythmic hooting of a different troop that had claimed the underground. They were trapped between a surface world of fire and a subterranean world of shadows, so Marcus made the call to head for the docks, hoping the open water of the Hudson would provide a natural barrier the primates wouldn't want to cross. They sprinted through an alleyway where the walls were painted with the bloody handprints of those who hadn't been fast enough, and emerged onto a pier where a group of civilians was huddled behind a stack of shipping containers. Marcus took command, organizing the able-bodied into a perimeter while he searched for a working radio or a boat with enough fuel to ferry them to the safety of the islands. The water was choppy, reflecting the orange glow of a city in its death throes, and as Marcus looked back toward the skyline, he saw the Empire State Building's lights flicker and die, symbol by symbol, until only the dark silhouette of the peak remained against the stars. He found a pilot boat with the keys still in the ignition, but as he turned the engine over, the roar of the motor acted as a dinner bell for the hunters nearby. A troop of guerrillas emerged from the shadows of a warehouse, their eyes reflecting the pier lights with a cold, predatory glint as they began to pick up pace into a full-speed knuckle run. Marcus stood on the deck of the boat and provided cover fire with a discarded rifle he'd scavenged, his shoulder bruised and purple from the recoil, but his aim true as he picked off the lead runners. The civilians scrambled aboard the boat, rocking violently in the wake of their panicked movements, while the first guerrilla reached the edge of the pier and leapt across the gap, landing on the stern with a metallic clang that shook the entire vessel. Marcus dropped the rifle and drew his combat knife, engaging in a desperate close-quarter struggle on the slick deck as the boat began to pull away from the dock, dragging the beast into the cold, dark waters of the Hudson. He managed to kick the creature back into the foam, watching it sink beneath the surface before he collapsed against the railing, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the lights of Manhattan receded into a distance that felt like another lifetime. He looked at the faces of the survivors and then back at the burning city, knowing that the fight for New York was far from over and that tomorrow he would have to find a way back into the heart of the jungle to take his city back. The boat drifted further into the dark expanse of the harbor as Marcus wiped the mixture of salt spray and primate blood from his forehead, feeling the heavy thrum of the engine beneath his boots like a dying heartbeat. He looked at the jagged skyline, where the fires of the city were reflected in the glass of half-destroyed towers, and realized the military response must have been crippled from the inside, because the radio channels were silent, except for the occasional burst of static and the haunting sounds of guerrillas mimicking the rhythmic patterns of human speech. He gathered the remaining survivors in the cramped cabin of the pilot boat, telling them to stay low while he scanned the shoreline of New Jersey, only to see that the infestation had spread to the shipping cranes, which now moved like giant skeletal arms under the control of apes who had learned to manipulate the heavy machinery. Marcus realized this wasn't just an invasion of muscle, but an invasion of intelligence, where the guerrillas were systematically deconstructing the infrastructure of the human world to build something of their own design. He steered the boat toward a small Coast Guard outpost near the Statue of Liberty, hoping to find a cache of high-grade explosives or a long-range transmitter to call for a National Guard extraction. But the torch of the statue was already flickering with a strange green flame, signaling that the island had been occupied. As they pulled closer to the concrete base of the monument, he saw hundreds of silverbacks lining the stone walls, each holding a piece of scavenged technology or a sharpened piece of rebar like a primitive spear. He cut the engine and let the boat drift into the shadows of a crumbling pier, signaling for his team to move with total silence, because the hearing of the invaders was far superior to any human scout. They crawled through a drainage pipe that smelled of brine and old oil, emerging into a storage bunker where crates of ammunition and heavy weaponry sat untouched by the chaos. Marcus grabbed an M249 saw and draped belts of ammunition over his shoulders, feeling the weight of the steel as a promise of retribution, while his fellow officers loaded up on flashbangs and thermite charges. They knew they couldn't retake the city with a handful of people, but they could take out the leadership of the troop that had established its throne at the base of the statue. Marcus led them through a series of maintenance tunnels that ran beneath the pedestal, hearing the heavy footfalls of the guerrillas above, which sounded like a drumline marking the end of an era. He found a ventilation shaft that overlooked the main staging area, where a massive gorilla, larger than any he had ever seen, sat atop a pile of discarded police shields and military helmets, wearing a tattered general's cloak as a trophy. This was the Alpha, the one who had coordinated the subway ambushes and the bridge blockades, and Marcus knew that if the head was severed, the body of the invasion might fracture into disorganized chaos. He signaled for the flashbangs to be dropped, and as the blinding white light filled the chamber, he dropped from the vent like a specter of the old world, pulling the trigger of the machine gun and letting the lead fly in a continuous stream of fire. The noise was absolute, a roar of mechanical fury that tore through the stone chamber as guerrillas scrambled in the confusion, their roars of pain lost in the thunder of the saw. Marcus didn't stop moving. He pushed forward through the smoke and the haze of copper-scented air, aiming for the Alpha, who had recovered from the blast and was now hurling a massive stone block with the speed of a professional pitcher. Marcus rolled to the left, the stone shattering against the wall behind him, and he dumped the rest of the belt into the Alpha's chest, watching the giant fall back against the base of the statue. The remaining guerrillas, seeing their leader fall, hesitated for a precious second, which gave the other officers enough time to set the thermite charges on the structural supports of the pedestal. Marcus yelled for everyone to get back to the pipe as the world began to melt, the intense heat of the thermite turning the steel and stone into a molten slurry that hissed as it collapsed. They sprinted back to the boat, the ground shaking beneath them as the great monument groaned and shifted, a symbol of the old world falling to protect the new one from its conquerors. They reached the deck and throttled the engine to the limit just as the explosion ripped through the base, sending a shockwave across the water that nearly capsized them. Marcus looked back and saw the silhouette of the statue leaning into the sea, but he also saw the hundreds of eyes still glowing on the Manhattan shore, realizing that the Alpha he killed was only one of many. He checked his remaining ammo and looked at the dawn breaking over the Atlantic, a gray and cold light that revealed the true extent of the devastation. But he didn't feel despair. He felt a cold, predatory hunger of his own. He was a New York cop, and as long as he had a badge and a bullet, he would keep hunting the hunters until the streets belonged to the people again, or until the jungle reclaimed every last inch of the concrete. He turned the boat back toward the city, toward the smoke and the roars, because he knew the only way out was through the heart of the beast. Marcus steered the pilot boat back toward the jagged silhouette of Lower Manhattan as the morning fog began to mix with the heavy black plumes of smoke rising from the financial district, where the guerrillas had established a fortress of twisted rebar and overturned armored trucks. He could see the silhouettes of apes patrolling the rooftops of the low-rise buildings along the water's edge, their posture mimicking the snipers that used to inhabit those same positions during high-security events. The water around the boat was filled with floating debris from the fallen monument and the charred remains of the wooden piers that had been torched to prevent any human landing parties from gaining a foothold. Marcus signaled to his squad to check their gear one last time as they approached a small service slip near Battery Park that seemed relatively clear of the heavy primate patrols. They jumped from the moving boat as it scraped against the barnacle-encrusted pilings, and Marcus immediately took cover behind a rusted shipping container that smelled of rotting fruit and wet fur. He looked through the scope of his rifle and saw a group of juvenile gorillas playing with a discarded police siren on the grass, while several massive silverbacks sat in a circle atop a pile of captured tactical radios, as if they were listening to the frequency of
the human resistance for entertainment. Marcus knew they needed to reach the old communications hub on Pearl Street to see if any of the emergency broadcast systems were still functional, or if the guerrillas had managed to jam the entire East Coast. They moved through the shadows of the tall buildings, using the narrow alleyways where the trash had piled up into mountain-sized barricades that the apes used for climbing and observation. A sudden shriek from above alerted them to a scout, a smaller ape hanging from a fire escape, and Marcus silenced it with a single muffled shot before the creature could alert the main troop. They reached the entrance of the communications hub, only to find the heavy steel doors had been peeled back like the skin of a banana, and the interior was a cavernous ruin of copper wire and smashed glass. Marcus stepped over the remains of a technician and felt a surge of cold fury as he saw the way the equipment had been systematically destroyed, with a precision that suggested the guerrillas knew exactly what they were doing to isolate the city. He found a secondary terminal in the basement that was still drawing power from a backup generator, and he began to frantically tap into the city's remaining CCTV network to see the true layout of the invasion. The screens flickered to life, showing the Brooklyn Bridge covered in a thick carpet of primates, moving toward the outer boroughs, and the Lincoln Tunnel flooded with water, where hundreds of apes were using the submerged cars as stepping stones to cross into Jersey. The map of New York was a sea of red indicators, showing where the police precincts had been overrun, and Marcus realized that his small band of survivors was likely the only organized force left in the southern tip of the island. He saw a live feed from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where the guerrillas were treating the statues like ancient ancestors, and he saw another feed from the stock exchange, where a massive silverback was rhythmically pounding on the opening bell with a human skull. Marcus pulled a flash drive from his pocket and began to download the coordinates of the primate nests while the sound of heavy knuckles hitting the pavement echoed from a street level above. The guerrillas had found them, and they were closing in from both ends of the street, with a coordinated pincer movement that showed they had studied human military tactics. Marcus grabbed a heavy fire axe from the wall and told his team to prepare for a breakout, because they were done hiding and were now going to take the fight to the main command center at City Hall. They burst through the back exit into a storm of gray fur and bared teeth, Marcus swinging the axe with a desperate strength that carved a path through the first line of attackers, while his officers provided a wall of lead that kept the larger males at bay. The street became a blur of motion and violence as they sprinted toward City Hall, passing the ruins of a city that had once been the center of the world, now reduced to a primitive hunting ground. They reached the steps of the building, where the mayor's flag had been replaced by a bloody pelt, and Marcus saw a line of guerrillas holding riot shields they had stolen from the precinct, forming a phalanx that blocked the entrance. He didn't slow down. He pulled a grenade from his vest and tossed it into the center of the formation, creating a gap that he dove through with his weapon firing until the barrel glowed red in the dim light of the corridor. Inside, the halls of power were silent, except for the heavy breathing of the beasts that stalked the offices, and Marcus felt like he was walking through a tomb of civilization. He reached the main council chamber and found the high-ranking silverbacks sitting in the seats of the representatives, their eyes following him with a chilling calmness that suggested they were waiting for him to arrive. Marcus realized then that this wasn't just an invasion, it was a trial, and he was the final witness for a human race that had failed to protect its own home. He stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the leaders of the New World, and he didn't feel fear. He felt the weight of his badge and the memory of every citizen he had sworn to protect. He raised his weapon and let out a roar of his own that challenged the silence of the chamber, a human defiance that refused to be silenced, even as the 1,000-strong army of the Wild closed in for the final kill. He fought with the strength of a man who had nothing left to lose, and everything to avenge, painting the marble floors with the cost of the city's fall. Even as his strength began to fade, he saw the lights of a rescue chopper on the horizon, and he knew that as long as one person kept fighting, the city was never truly lost. The ammunition in Marcus's rifle finally clicked on an empty chamber, as the grand doors of the City Hall Council chamber groaned under the weight of a dozen more silverbacks pushing their way inside to claim the final pocket of human resistance. Marcus dropped the useless weapon and drew his backup sidearm, his hands steady despite the exhaustion that threatened to collapse his lungs and the blood that matted his hair. He looked at the Alpha sitting in the speaker's chair, a beast with a scar across its eye that seemed to recognize the uniform Marcus wore as a symbol of the old order that had once caged its kind. Around the room, his remaining officers were backed into the corners, their flashlights cutting through the dust and the shadows to reveal a
sea of dark fur and gleaming eyes that numbered in the hundreds just within the building itself. The air was thick with the scent of ozone from the dying electrical grid and the primal musk of the victors, but Marcus refused to drop his gaze from the leader of the invasion. He felt a strange calm wash over him, a realization that he had fulfilled his oath to the very end, as he saw the silhouettes of the rescue choppers hovering outside the massive arched windows, their spotlights sweeping the room like the eyes of God. The Alpha let out a low, guttural hoot that signaled the final charge, and Marcus squeezed the trigger of his pistol, the muzzle flashes illuminating the faces of the primates as they lunged across the mahogany desks with the force of a tidal wave. He felt the impact of a massive fist against his shoulder, throwing him back against the city seal on the wall, but he managed to fire one last shot that struck the Alpha's crown before a heavy hand clamped down on his wrist. Outside the windows, the sky erupted in a series of white-hot streaks as the military finally authorized a scorched earth strike on the command centers of the invasion, choosing to level the monuments of the past to ensure the future of the species. Marcus saw the flash of the incoming missiles reflected in the eyes of his attackers, and he knew that in a few seconds, the marble and the muscle would all be returned to the dust together. He closed his eyes and thought of the city as it used to be. The sound of the subway, the smell of the street carts, and the endless pulse of millions of lives that had now been silenced by the return of the wild. The first explosion ripped through the ceiling of City Hall, sending a cascade of stone and fire down upon the assembly, and as the structure buckled, Marcus felt a sense of grim satisfaction that the invaders would find no throne here. The roar of the fire drowned out the roars of the apes as the entire block was consumed in a tactical purification that turned the heart of the rebellion into a funeral pyre. Hours later, as the smoke cleared over the charred remains of the island, the only sound left was the wind whistling through the hollow shells of the skyscrapers, and the distant cry of a single gorilla echoing from the heights of the Chrysler Building. The invasion had been broken by the fire, but the city was a ghost of itself, a silent monument to the day the jungle came to claim its due. Marcus Thorne's badge lay buried beneath 3 feet of rubble, polished by the heat of the blast, a silver star in the dark soil of a new and silent world. New York had fallen, but it had died fighting, and as the sun rose over the ruins of the harbor, the water of the Hudson began to wash the ash away, starting the long, slow process of reclamation. The War of the 1,000 Gorillas was over, and the silence that followed was the only peace the city had left.